Whether it be anime or games, I've always been pretty interested in the art of animation. It feels like something difficult to get into because it's hard to know where to even start. I actually tried it after watching some Stickman animations back when I was 13, but my feeble 13-year-old mind couldn't commit for any longer than an hour. Other than that, I have pretty much zero art experience going into this. I'm going to be doing pixel animation in a program called Sprite, mostly because it's easier to fine-tune things without a drawing tablet, but also because I like how pixel art looks. In this video, I'm going to be going over some of the animations I made, while also sharing some of the lessons I learned, and you'll also get to know a little bit more about me along the way. So, with that being said, let's start off with day 1. With day 1, I actually had no plan starting out, so I decided to figure it out as I went. I got to play with a lot of animation fundamentals here, and it ended up being a pretty educational first project. It started out with me having no ideas and putting down a black rectangle, and then I made it transform into a liquid, and then I changed the black rectangle into an orange, and the rest kinda wrote itself. One of the things I didn't expect was how hard animating liquid was, having to go through many failed attempts before it looks almost okay. Overall, I'm pretty proud of my first project, and this made me kinda excited to keep on animating. By doing that animation, I learned two main things, the first being arcs. So in 1981, these two guys from Disney published a book, and it has a ton of useful knowledge for animators in it. One of them is that arcs are good. In general, arcs are more appealing to look at than flat movement. Pretty much every movement you can think of will have some component of arcs. For the orange animation, I took it to the extreme and I made literally every single movement into an arc. The second thing I learned was squash and stretch. This is another one out of the Disney playbook, and it's used to convey speed and momentum. If something was going really fast, you would stretch it out, and if something comes to a sudden stop, you would squash it. Check out this bouncing ball I made. While the timing is right, it still looks stiff. However, when I add a squash and stretch to it, it looks a lot better. For my second day, I wanted to try something scary. I originally wasn't going to try animating people until later because humans are complicated, but I figured that I wouldn't learn with that attitude. So anyways, how I ended up doing it was making the movements myself in real life, and then seeing where my arms and legs would go. I actually swung a broom around in my basement to figure this one out. If you stare at it for long enough, you'll notice that the rotation is a bit weird. This is because while the arms are rotating around the body, the legs are in the same spot. The jump also doesn't make a lot of sense since the hammer looks like it suddenly changes direction. Despite the faults, I think this was a very solid first attempt at a character, and I'm happy with how it turned out. With day 2, I learned about slow in and slow out. This is actually a concept that I was already somewhat familiar with, as I use it in my editing all of the time. The idea is that things almost never move at a constant velocity. It'll take time to start up and time to slow down. How long it takes to start and stop actually depends on the mass of the object, because physics. Since my character was swinging a hammer, I had to make sure it felt heavy. In hindsight, I should have made it even slower, but no point in worrying about that now. After day 2's success, I wanted to go even bigger. I decided I'd set my sights on animating perspective. To be honest, I bit off way more than I could chew here. The characters are off model on every frame of the perspective changes, and the background doesn't even rotate properly. One of the main issues was my method. I mostly eyeballed it, like I've always done up until now, but when dealing with perspective, I definitely could have used some guidelines. The one good thing I can say about it is that the apple particles work really well to show slow motion. Overall, I wasn't very proud of this one, and I'd consider this my first failure of the month. Why am I doing this? The easiest time to quit is after your first failure, and this was no exception. I tend to be pretty bad at committing to things, since my mind isn't much less feeble as when I was 13. However, this time there was something that kept me from quitting. I used to be a Tetris pro, and at my peak I was in the top 25. However, I quickly found myself shaping my personal identity around being good at Tetris. When you put so much of your self-worth into one thing, you become afraid of doing anything else, so while I built this house of cards around me, I didn't realize that if you took away Tetris, I'd be nothing, and that's a harrowing thought to have. I want to change myself and be more confident by learning things that aren't Tetris. I guess the reason I didn't quit like I usually would, to put it simply, is because I really want to change myself for the better. Okay, so I know what you're thinking, and first of all, the meme was still fresh back then, but second of all, it wasn't even my idea. I actually streamed this one on Twitch, and while it was just gonna be a normal pool ball, people in chat were making Among Us jokes, so I decided to feed the trolls. Anyways, for this one, I wanted to make the guy walk back to the hole and jump in like it was a vent, but I couldn't make the walking look natural. Every attempt I did ended horribly, so at the end I just gave up and chose a different route. Despite that, I'm still pretty happy with how it turned out, and I think that it flows really well. For day 5, I wanted to make something cool. It's quite the step up from day 2's hammer swing, now using a much wider range of movement. I stuck to the same method of doing the movements in real life to know where each limb would go, but this time I had to imagine different weapons. The ending of it is a bit rushed, and I should have used a better mix of light and heavy weapons, but I'm still happy with it. While I was already using simple smears on day 1, I only really understood what I was doing after making Armory. Put simply, a smear frame is when you smear an object that's moving really fast to convey a big movement. You can think of them similarly to stretching in Squash&Stretch. Smears are most effective in combinations with the principles arcs and slow in and out. Let's take this quick sword slash for example. I placed the frames to respect slow in and out, but it still looks really weird and unnatural due to the fast movement. But then I add a smear to it, and the movement starts to make more sense, and it actually starts looking like a sword slash. With day 7, I decided to make my first attempt at having multiple scenes. Once I had made up my mind on ping pong, I had to watch a bunch of real-life footage to see how the players moved. The first really difficult thing was making the smaller movements. One of the things that I'd realized is that subtle movements can be a lot more difficult than big flashy movements, since they require more polish to look right. For the longest time, my cuts looked really jarring, but I realized something important, less to do with animation and closer to filmmaking and editing. I realized that even through the cuts, time should be constantly moving at the same rate. This means that between scene changes, the ball's position would need to make sense and follow the flow of time. Once I synced up the ball's position throughout the entire animation, I'd say it turned out pretty well. Even 5 days later, I was still really frustrated at my inability to animate walking from day 4, so I finally decided to tackle it again. After I did some quick research into how people animate walking, it turned out to be way easier than I was making it out to be. After I had one person walking, I had no idea why, but I decided to animate 2 more of them and paste them on a random conveyor belt. Like, I don't know what I was thinking. Anyways, it's a bit weird, but I'm still satisfied that I was finally able to animate walking. So after looking into the theory for walking animations, I found out that you can boil it down to a cycle of poses. Your average walk cycle will consist of 4 main poses named contact, down, passing, and up, and this set will be repeated twice, one for each leg. Something that's very important is the head position. During the down and up poses, it's important that the head also goes down or up, because otherwise the body will look like it's elongating and shrinking. You can also add and remove frames from the basic 8-frame run cycle. For example, Megumin uses 4 frames, only showing contact and passing. As another example, this random Nike ad that I found uses 12 frames, with more frames being added to the up part since it takes more force to move up when you're heavier. Going into day 13, I wanted to make something involving magic. Because my plan was more elaborate, I had to take a different approach than my previous ones. Up until now, I had always used an animation method called straight ahead. This simply means that you make one frame and then you make the next and so on in a linear fashion. However, because of the more distinct poses in my animation, I tried the more standard method, which is using keys. All this means is that I draw the main poses first and then do the frames in between after. This is also the first time that I used a character design instead of a blank guy. I actually did use a blank guy at first, and then made sure that I got the poses and timing down before replacing it with an actual character. I think that all of that paid off because the end result is really well timed, and it's still one of my favorites through all the 30 days. After making that animation, I started to notice something in myself. I realized that I was ending each day a lot more satisfied, and I'd finally understood why. Hopefully what I'm going to say will be in some way relatable. Up until now, video games have been a big part of my life. I'd grown up playing them, and I eventually decided to start making videos, streaming, running a community, and a whole bunch of other stuff, all centered around video games. The problem is that for the most part, video games are a hollow experience. I don't mean that they aren't fun. I certainly had and still do have fun playing games, but once I'm done and the fun is had, I'm not left particularly satisfied with the experience. When I try to recall my time playing games, it all just meshes together into one blurry blob of memory, and I can't seem to pick out any particular moments, despite having a lot of good times and accomplishments. After I started making animations, it feels like every day is unique. Now, I can look back and remember what I've made each day. When I look at one of my animations, I remember all of the time I spent on it, what I struggled on, the things I was inspired by, what I learned, and so on. While I admit that some of this could be a honeymoon type phase for me, I think there's something special about getting a random idea, spending hours making it, and then being able to point at it and, regardless of whether it's good or bad, say I made that. I'm not trying to say that playing video games is bad or that you shouldn't do it, but I think that there's something uniquely gratifying about art and the creative process that's worth exploring. If you found my situation relatable, I highly recommend spending time creating something. You won't regret it. After making the orb animation, I wanted to try something different. Remember when I said that subtle movements can be a lot more difficult than big ones? I thought that I'd try making an animation with only subtle movements. This led me to making an idle animation. Honestly, I absolutely nailed this one. I surprised myself. There's a lot of small moving parts, with wind blowing from right to left. The cape was particularly difficult to make. I had no idea where to start, so I ended up making a sine wave and then drawing a bunch of wavy lines above it until it worked. Despite the low IQ brute force method, it turned out great. The crazy thing is that I almost didn't make this because I thought it'd be too hard. Anyways, I'm super pleased with how it turned out, and this animation marks the halfway point for the 30 days. By making an idle animation, I learned a very important concept that's unique to pixel art called subpixel movement. While you can't physically move things by fractions of a pixel, you can manipulate it to make it look that way. Keep in mind that I'm going to be using a very loose definition of subpixel. There's a ton of different ways to make subpixel movement, such as breaking it into smaller parts or shifting colors. Here's some examples. This resting animation from Metal Slug shifts the colors around on each frame, making for very clear but subtle movements. Did you know that the bouncing slime animation I showed earlier also uses this concept? If you look at the contact and apex of the jump, you'll notice that the ball hangs there for 2 frames, but each one shifts pixels like a kind of wave being forced down and up to complement the jump. Day 18 marks the start of more difficulty spikes. You can tell I had a really fun time in my basement with this one. I wanted to learn how fire particles worked, so I set out to make a movement that made use of them. I actually spent a dumb amount of time working out the keyframes for this, and you can blame my lack of anatomy knowledge for that. I was drawing the legs like they were singular long noodles, and it was making the spin look super awkward, but once I realized that knees existed, the process was sped up tremendously. This animation took the longest out of all of them so far, taking 9 hours to complete, and even then it looks a bit wonky, but overall, it wasn't bad. Another big difficulty spike coming in with day 20. This is the very first time that I tried making something in a 3-dimensional space since day 3, and it was super difficult to figure out. I was originally planning to make a random animation to learn how to draw electricity, but I ended up making something much cooler. This was the first time I had to worry a lot about anatomy, and I think that my lack of knowledge bleeds through, with the muscles looking odd in some places. Drawing a body from different angles was kind of a nightmare, but I'd like to believe that I came out on top with this one. This animation had by far the most challenges for me to face so far, but I'm glad I stuck with it. I feel like I've become more confident in myself through animation. In the past, I've been somebody who would quit when things get difficult. I would start a new project with high hopes, work my way into a challenge, and then just sit there. It was like paralysis. It's not that I was lazy or had no motivation, but I didn't feel like I was good enough to step forward. Recently, especially with the last one, I'd start working on an animation and then come across an overwhelming challenge, an obstacle that I have no idea how to traverse. The difference now is that instead of getting stuck, I'm able to push headfirst into it and figure it out. This doesn't just apply to animation either. The fact that this video even got uploaded is proof of that. I actually feel the best I ever had in my life because of this. It truly feels like I don't need to have Tetris to be somebody that I'm proud of. So to put it simply, getting out of my comfort zone was worth it. Alright, we made it to day 25. So going along with fire and electricity, we have water. I actually watched slow motion footage of water in space to see how it behaved, and the way physics acts there really confused me. I tried recreating that, and I think the bubble turned out pretty nice. I can't quite say the same about the rest of the animation though. It was pretty rushed, since I had spent way too much time staring at a bubble of water floating around in space. There's a lot of timing issues, like the clap on the bubble not looking snappy enough, and the bow dissipating being an unsatisfying ending. Overall, I'm not too happy with how this one turned out, but at least I finally figured out how water works. Since I had just finished Jujutsu Kaisen at the time, I decided to use one of the characters. I wanted to do something cooler than just a 2D attack, so I added this cut-in for the wind-up of the hammer swing. This took a total of 17 hours of almost non-stop focused work, which is kind of insane and definitely not healthy. A big part of the reason why it took so long is because I had to remake a lot of it from scratch. Let me explain. I was using manga panels as a reference, but I didn't realize that this character is actually ambidextrous. From panel to panel, she uses whichever hand is convenient to swing the hammer, which I was not expecting. Because of this, I had to remake the entire cut-in when I was already almost finished, which was super annoying. I'm still very proud of it, but if anything, it left me wondering how I could top it in day 30. Before we move on to day 30, I want to show some stuff that came from a live stream that I did. On my Twitch channel, I did a 3-hour lesson stream where I tried teaching some of the animation things I learned. I used to do Tetris coaching, so I wanted to see how well my teaching skills transferred. As it turns out, I'd say it went pretty well. Here's some of the stuff that viewers sent in. Keep in mind that this was their very first time animating. I think if this says anything, is that while the skill cap for animation is extremely high, you don't need to be an expert to start making something basic, which I think is very cool. So going into day 30, I wanted to do something that connected everything together and uses everything that I've learned this past month. Since I was struggling to generate any good ideas, I started rewatching anime that I thought were well animated. It was 2 hours in when I noticed something that blew my mind. Near the end of Mob Psycho episode 4, there's these few cuts that I paused to analyze. When I looked at these 3 shots, I noticed that while they're at different angles and distances, the hand still followed the same arc relative to the screen. This was a huge revelation to me, since I discovered an entire new dimension to animation. Let's say I want to animate a box being pushed. I realized that I should consider not only how far the box moves relative to itself, but also where it moves on the screen. A box sliding 3 meters east could make a large movement on the screen, a small one, or could even shrink it. With that idea, I finally decided what I was going to do. So here we are, day 30. I wanted to go with a final boss theme to fit the final animation, so I made this RPG-like side view. The twist is that there would be a large animation to move the character a short distance from left to right, relative to the screen. Notice how the character leaps into each new shot, starting from the left side but slowly crossing to the right, until jumping back into the original frame to finish the attack. I also successfully incorporated everything that I've learned. The first section uses a smear for the sword, squash and stretch for the jump, and an arc that links the two shots together, like I learned from anime. The second section involves a run cycle, which is a lot harder to draw when on an angle, and also includes some subpixel movement to make the hood look like it's bobbing and rippling back. The third section involves another arc jump, this time between 3 shots, more motion line squash and stretch with the jump, slow in and out with the build up to the big slash, and the big smear to finish it off. Words can't describe how much satisfaction I got from finishing this. This is by far the best animation that I've made by a very, very long shot. I'm really happy with myself for not only making this, but also sticking with the challenge for a whole month. I really could not have asked for a better finale to my 30 days of animation. So that's the end of the video. However, before you click off, there's something I want to formally tell you. This is something that you'll hear from pretty much every YouTuber, including me in my older videos, but I want to be more sincere about it this time. To you, the person watching this video, whether you watched it fully, tucked it away as background noise, or even if you skipped past some parts, thank you for watching. While I used to think that I needed to be the Tetris guy for people to care, by watching this video, you've become proof that that isn't the case, and that really means a lot to me. I already feel like I've been able to change this past month, even if only a little bit, which is a huge win in my books. Also, to the 2 Patreon subs who stuck with me despite my move away from Tetris, I made each of you an animation. I hope you like them. If you want to support me and this channel, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description. If you want to talk to me and my community, consider joining my new non-Tetris Discord server. Chances are, I'll be there to say hi to you when you join, since I have no life. Not really sure what I want to do with that server yet, but I guess we'll see as time goes on. You should also follow me on Twitter at garbocan_ to see where this journey goes next. Once again, thanks for watching. There's not much left to say, so yeah, this has been my 30 days of animation. I hope you liked it.